Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. With Scream 6 on its way this year, as well as the teaser we got, I decided to do a review series of each film in the franchise that we've gotten so far. Now I'm capping it off with my personal ranking of each film. Let's go ahead and get into it. Alright guys, I'm a realist, and I know that there's a bunch of people who have no nuance whatsoever, and basically believe if you're not first, you're last, in the immortal words of Ricky Bobby. If a movie doesn't make the top 3 spots of a ranking, those people take that as you saying the movie sucks. But I assure you that is honestly not the case here. I actually like every single movie we've gotten in this franchise so far. Every one of them got at least a 7 out of 10 from me or better. But there's some that I just prefer over others. And I'm well aware that my ranking is going to look a lot different than most fans of these movies. Love of film is obviously subjective, but just like any long-running franchise with a vocal and outspoken fan base, the best and worst of these sequels have been basically universally decided on by the fans, with Scream 2 being crowned the best sequel and Scream 3 being deemed the worst. Well, I'm here to mix things up because I don't subscribe to the status quo, and it's not because I'm not a true fan or I'm late to the party. I grew up with these movies and have loved them since day one. I've seen every single one of them in theaters. I just don't view these movies the same as everyone else. And that's okay, because if this ranking reflected your opinions, it would no longer be my list. It would be your list. And then there would be no point in you even watching this video. And last but not least, this is just a ranking video, so I won't be going into any great detail with each movie, but if you are interested in seeing my full thoughts on all these movies, I have made individual videos reviewing each one of them and put them in my Scream playlist, which I'll leave a card for at the end of this video. So after this video, you can go ahead and check those out if you want. But anyways, jumping right into it, coming in at number 5 is Scream 2. Not a bad movie. Again, none of these are bad. This is just not an overly rewatchable one for me. I skip this one almost every time, in fact. Even if I'm marathoning them, I generally go right past this one and jump straight to 3. It does have a great cast as usual, but it has an opening that just annoys me and a killer reveal that bores me, and everything in between just feels soulless to me. I will say that it turned out a lot better than most sequels that come out just a year after the original, because we still technically got a solid return, but it just clung so tight to that original Scream formula that the first one did so well. A couple of other sequels did this as well, but unlike those films, which will be higher up in this video, Scream 2 didn't do anything else to stand on its own. So while it is technically a solid film, it just used the same template as the first movie, but didn't do it nearly as good and didn't do anything to set it apart or make it one that I want to go back to, basically ever. So if I'm ever in the mood to watch that template, I'm just going to go to the movie that did it better and watch Scream 1 or one of the other sequels. Now, if you haven't clicked off this video yet and you're still watching, coming in at number 4 is Scream 3. I know, this is most people's number 5. They'd probably rank it even lower if they could. But I just always appreciated what this movie tried to be. I mean, I liked it from the first time I seen it, and I praise it for what it got right. And for me personally, I believe this movie is more than the sum of its parts. Its good qualities are strong enough to carry its weaknesses as far as I'm concerned. It took a risk and gave us something wildly different from what we had seen up until that point, and honestly, even since. I know people complain that this movie feels less bloody and less brutal than the others, and I guess technically that is true because of the controversy around the production of this film and when it came out and the actual events that were happening in the world at the time of its production, which I do go into in more detail in my review. But let's face it, in terms of slashers, the Scream movies are all pretty tame and uncreative, so even the bloodiest of these movies aren't nearly as bloody as other franchises. But that's really not what we come to these movies for. And yeah, this movie does lean a little heavier into the camp and comedy than the other films, which I will admit is a little uneven feeling when you consider some of the subject matter of this film. When you start getting into Maureen Prescott's backstory and find out all of the things that happened to her early on in her life, it gets pretty dark and treads on territory that none of the other movies had ever touched base on. The first one kind of dipped its toe in that, but didn't really go there. And when you combine that with the otherwise campy Scooby-Doo tone of this movie, it is a bit jarring, and I completely recognize and understand that complaint, which is why it's number 4 and not any higher. But we did get one of the best third acts and probably the best Sidney of this franchise, period. The character of Sidney Prescott was fully realized in this film. This movie, and especially this third act, is the reason she's probably my favorite final girl. But moving on. And at number 3 is Scream 5. This is just a pretty safe return, guys. When the marketing started, everybody thought this movie was going to go off in a bunch of different crazy directions, myself included. But what we actually got was just a by-the-numbers Scream movie. But I was more forgiving of it in this movie than I was with Scream 2. And this may seem like a cop-out, but that's partly because the Scream movies have always been self-aware. So, considering that this movie was a legacy sequel where the characters are aware that it's a legacy sequel and more or less a soft reboot with the killers patterning the events of the first Scream, then it works for me. Plus, this movie does just enough of its own thing to set it apart from the original. It introduces us to new, stronger, and more likable characters than Part 2, I think. It gives us an opening that felt familiar, but was still very fresh and unpredictable. It utilized the legacy characters almost perfectly. I do have some problems with how they handled them, and I do go into that more in my review for this movie, but it was mostly handled correctly, and overall I just enjoyed watching it more, which is probably the most important thing to me. It doesn't matter how technically good a movie is if it has no rewatch value, and this movie does, so it sits comfortably right here at number 3. And at my number 2 spot, and probably the second most controversial pick of this ranking as well, is Scream 4. And from my observation, this probably is the most divisive film in this franchise. A lot of fans say it's the second worst Scream movie, or even sometimes the worst Scream movie. And then you have another group of fans that seem to love this movie, and even a smaller group of fans that put it as the second best in the franchise, which is the camp I lean into, obviously, since it is my number 2. Sure, we get a sloppy opening, which I forgot to even address in my review for this movie, and it's not a very good opening, but once you get past that, you get probably the best group of characters that we've had since the original, including Kirby, played by Hayden Panettiere, who instantly became a fan favorite to the point that a very vocal majority of this fan base, including a lot of people who didn't even like this film overall, has been begging for them to bring her back, and we're finally getting that in Scream 6. We get arguably the best and most unpredictable third act of any of these films, including the first one. It's definitely my personal favorite. We get Jill, who is hands down my favorite killer. We get the most vicious Ghostface of any of these movies, I think. He just feels meaner than ever in this movie. It's the perfect blend of fun and horror that we've had since the original. It's my most rewatchable of any of these movies. I remember sitting in the theater watching this and thinking to myself, this is going to go down in history as one of, if not the best sequels. I thought it was such a good return. And then years later, I got plugged into social media and found out this was actually one of, if not the most polarizing entry in this franchise. And I'll admit, I was a little let down by that. But I don't let it bother me anymore. People are allowed to have their own opinions, just like me. I just honestly don't understand how this movie could get as much hate as it does from any Scream lover. Other than the color grading that they used for this movie, it's almost a perfect entry for me. I honestly considered making this my number 1 for the rewatchability alone, but I just couldn't bring myself to do that because the original still exists, which leads me into my actual number 1 spot. And that is Wes Craven's 1996 classic, Scream. Generally, I'm not the type of guy who just crowns the first movie of any franchise the best just simply for being the first. I actually expect it to be the best if I'm going to give it that title. But in this case, you almost have to, because the ideas and concepts that were introduced in this movie that were the basis for all the subsequent sequels are just perfected in this movie. So no matter how good any of the sequels got, they were still just a replication of the original and just playing second fiddle. This movie also quite literally single-handedly revitalized an otherwise dead genre and inspired an entire era of slashers that never quite hit the same mark that Scream did, but left this perfect little time capsule of movies for us to remember and still enjoy to this day. There's just no way that I could ever justify not putting this as my number one. It's not only a perfect slasher and a perfect standalone movie, but it was also the perfect beginning to what ultimately became one of the most consistent horror franchises in terms of quality that we've ever gotten. I have nothing bad to say about this movie, and I will unapologetically leave it right here at number one. But anyways, that's it for this video, guys. Did you agree with any of my picks? Let me know your ranking down in the comments section and we can keep this conversation going. Or you can find me on one of my socials, which are linked in the video descriptions of all my videos. In the meantime, go ahead and like and share this video. If you haven't already, please subscribe and I'll catch you guys in the next one.